The NewsHour has reported from Yemen many times over the years, but access to the territory held by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels is rare and dangerous. That's why we take note of the series of reports we begin tonight, originating from that region. First, a word of warning. Images in this story may disturb some viewers, but they're necessary to show what is happening in one of the world's most desperate places, trapped in a brutal war that the United States is supporting through a Saudi-led coalition. Special correspondent Jane Ferguson has just returned from rebel-held Yemen, and tonight brings us the first of 3 reports from behind rebel lines.
Life is slipping away from Maimona Shagadar. She suffers the agony of starvation in silence. No longer able to walk or talk, at 11 years old, little Maimona's emaciated body weighs just 24 pounds. Watching over her is older brother Najib, who brought her to this remote hospital in Yemen, desperate to get help. The nurses here fight for the lives of children who are starving.
Because of the war, she is suffering from malnutrition. Her father is jobless. Most of the families in Yemen are jobless.
Every day, she says she sees these sorts of cases. People have lost work, therefore they've no money, therefore there's just no food in the house.
You were never supposed to see these images of Maimona. A blockade of rebel-held northern Yemen stops reporters from getting here. Journalists are not allowed on flights into the area. No cameras, no pictures.
The only way into rebel-held Yemen is to smuggle yourself in. And for me, that means to be dressed entirely as a Yemeni woman with a full face veil just to get through the checkpoints.
I traveled across the embattled front lines to see what's actually happening inside what the United Nations is calling the world's worst humanitarian disaster.
Hello.
The Houthis cautiously welcomed me in, and once I was there, watched me closely. The hunger here and this human catastrophe is entirely man-made. Yemen was already one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, and the war has pushed an already needy people to the brink of famine. In the midst of political chaos in Yemen after the Arab Spring, Houthi rebels from the north captured the capital Sana'a in 2014, before sweeping south and causing the country's then president to flee. Neighboring Sunni Saudi Arabia views the Houthis, from a Yemeni sect close to Shia Islam and backed by rival Iran, as an unacceptable threat along their border. So it formed a military coalition of countries in 2015, determined to defeat the Houthis and reinstate the old president. Crucial military support for the campaign is provided by the United States, a longtime ally of Saudi Arabia. After 3 years of aerial bombardment and fighting on the ground, the coalition has, so far, failed to dislodge the rebels. What the campaign has done is devastate the economy, leaving 2/3 of the population relying on food aid for survival, and over 8 million people on the brink of starvation. I traveled across this country to see for myself what that looks like. Since ancient times, Yemenis have lived securely in villages perched high up on mountaintops. But now, they can't hold off the hunger, like in Rafia village.
Because most of the people in these areas are so desperately poor, they cannot afford to transport their children into the towns to the hospitals whenever their malnutrition gets so bad their lives are in danger. And so many of the worst cases are in small villages scattered all around these mountain ranges, just like this.
Hannah and her little brother Ali are frighteningly thin. Their grandma tells me food prices shot up beyond their reach when the fighting started.
1 month after the war started, we were starving. We are dying from hunger and we don't know what to do.
Their dad, Ahmed, picks up occasional work whenever it's available, but most of the time, all he can afford to give them is a smile. Nearby sits Gibran, so frail he can no longer walk. The Saudi-led coalition imposes a blockade on rebel-held Yemen because they say Houthi rebels are bringing in weapons from Iran. All food coming into the country must get approval from Saudi Arabia. That process is frustratingly slow and has helped push food prices up.
Our silos.
Yahya al-Habari is one of Yemen's main importers of wheat. He says Saudi inspections in nearby ports hold everything up.
All our wheat shipments, which each shipment worth about 16 to 18 million US dollars, get stops, in Djibouti for 6 to 5 weeks, which every single day costs us 25,000 US dollars demurrage for the ship owners.
Bridges have been bombed and businesses destroyed by airstrikes. Government workers in Houthi-controlled areas of the north haven't been paid in 2 years. Before the war, the Yemeni government was the country's biggest employer by far. When wages suddenly stopped, millions lost their livelihoods. Stephen Anderson runs the United Nations World Food Programme in Yemen.
The very simple fact is that most of the civil servants, as from September 2016, have no longer regularly received their salaries. That's affecting the civil servants with their families. That's almost 9 million people out of a country of 28, 29 million.
That's what happened to Maymona's family. Her father was a public school teacher, a job that pays middle-class wages here. Now, with almost no money coming in, they are destitute. I went back to the hospital to check on her a few days later. Her mother had arrived from their village.
My husband now receives half a month's salary in 1 year, and when it comes, we have debts to pay that are more than the salary. The house is full of kids, and we don't have anything to give them.
Maimona was feeling better after some treatment. The doctors have saved her life for now, but the money problems that nearly killed her will still be there when she returns home. The Saudi-led bombing campaign and blockade have brought Yemen's economy to its knees. The Houthis also make life difficult for aid workers to get access to the most needy. Mistrust and harassment of foreign aid organizations is pervasive. They are on the ground here, but most international staff stay in the capital.
Camps like this are very close to the fighting and the intensive airstrikes just over there. International aid workers cannot access areas as dangerous as this very often, and even the Yemeni aid workers often struggle to help these people.
Meanwhile, the crisis is spiraling, with the number of people going hungry rising by the day.
Human cost of the war.
Lise Grande heads up the UN's humanitarian efforts in Yemen.
Most of the 8.5 million people that we describe as being pre-famine, the reality of their life is that when they wake up in the morning, they have no idea if they will eat that day. No idea. 8.5 million people are in that category. The UN estimates that by the end of the year, if there is not an end to this war, another 10 million Yemenis will be in that same situation. That's 18 million innocent civilians who are the victims of this war. And that's why all humanitarians are saying, enough is enough. There has to be a political solution, and the parties to the conflict have to sit at that table and agree on how to stop this.
The warring parties are not yet listening to that call. Last month, an offensive for Hodeidah city, currently controlled by the Houthis, was launched by the Saudi-led coalition. Almost all the food coming in to rebel-held Yemen travels through that port. A battle risks shutting it and cutting off supplies to millions. If they hope to survive, the malnourished children arriving into Yemen's hospitals will need to hold on even longer for this disaster to ease. The truth is, many of them won't outlive this war. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jane Ferguson in Hajjah, Yemen.
And now, after her reporting trip to Houthi-controlled Yemen, we have our intrepid special correspondent, Jane Ferguson, here in our studio. Jane, that was very hard to watch, such important reporting, which leads me to this question. It's been difficult for reporters to get to where you got behind rebel lines. How did you do that?
To get in, I had to go alone. I tried for a very long time to see if it was possible to bring a team in, a cameraman of my own, and that wasn't possible simply because I had to be smuggled in. As you saw in the piece there, I was dressed as a Yemeni woman. So that was the only way to get past the checkpoints. And otherwise, essentially, it's just a case of driving in and hoping you're not asked for ID and turned back or arrested on the way.
So tell us a little bit about you. There are two more stories to come in this series. Tell us a little bit about them. The first one explains more of what the U.S. role here is.
That's right. The next story that will be up, we'll be talking about the aerial bombardment of these areas. There's been an aerial campaign, a bombing campaign against the Houthi rebels, and that has been essentially carried out by the Saudi-led coalition of countries that are fighting the Houthis. But there is a role played by the U.S. military, one that is sort of more passively behind and not quite as visible. And so we're going to be looking at that role.
And just quickly, the third report then in the series, the Houthis themselves, who are they, their connection to Iran?
They are a group, which is becoming more well known as this conflict carries on. But because the journalists aren't able to get into those areas, that's also been hindering a greater understanding of who they are. They've been accused by the Saudis and the Americans of having very close relationships with Iran, being completely armed by Iran, being allied with Hezbollah, having more of a formal relationship with them. They say that that's not the case at all. They have a political alliance, a philosophical alliance, but that they themselves are an independent Yemeni group fighting against what they see as an invading force.
It becomes such a subject of political dispute, including right here in this country. Jane Ferguson, such important reporting. Thank you.
Thank you.